What if I told you if the government cuts the taxes to boost the economy, it may have absolutely no real effect? Doesn't that sound shocking, right? Hello everyone, welcome to Concept Battles. And today we are going to take one of the most complex economic battles that we've seen, that is Ricardian equivalence versus fiscal deficit. So let's settle this. Now, let's start with a more familiar concept. Now, what is fiscal deficit as such? So, whenever government expenditures actually increase or whenever government expenditure becomes greater than revenue, that is when fiscal deficit increases, right? And how does the government actually fill this gap? Either it goes for borrowing or it starts printing money. In both these cases, there is a negative impact on the economy's currency value. But still, to maintain the expenditures, to maintain the rising expenditures, it is important for the government to undertake. They cannot lose on to certain necessities. And just to fulfill the requirements of the country, they have to take up expenditures, right? Now, why does fiscal deficit takes place? Why does government spend more than what it is earning? Basically, this spending is mainly to inject demand in the economy, to boost the aggregate demand. Once the aggregate demand actually increases, the production would increase, right? And once the production increases, the incomes will increase, which will ultimately boost the growth of the country, isn't it? Well, fiscal deficit is mainly a strategy that is adopted in a recessionary phase, right? Simple logic being more spending means more demand, means more growth. But a pessimistic opinion also exists, and that is your Ricardian equivalence. Now, what does Ricardian equivalence states? That consumers are very rational. This is the primary assumption of Ricardian equivalence, that the consumers are the most rational being, having perfect knowledge about everything. So, if the government reduces the taxes, people would know that yes, there are chances that taxes may increase in the future. And as a result, to avoid any sort of burden in the future, they start saving more at present. So while the tax cut was a part of the government's strategy to boost the demand, tax cut means there is an expansionary fiscal policy that is in force, right? And expansionary fiscal policy's main agenda is to increase the aggregate demand. But when consumers are rational, they will anticipate that a tax cut at present may lead to higher taxes in the future, right? Or in the long run. And as a result, to avoid any sort of burden, financial burden on themselves, they tend to save more, right? For any sort of unforeseen events. So as a result, this anticipation leads to absolutely zero effect of any sort of expansionary government policy or fiscal policy that takes place, right? Now let's break it down clearly, right? So when government spending is concerned, it is mainly, as per the fiscal deficit view, it is mainly to boost the aggregate demand. We are boosting that aggregate demand. Whatever monetary benefits that are provided by the government to the country's population, it's mainly to increase the aggregate demand, right? Whereas Ricardian equivalence states that any sort of expansionary fiscal policy or any sort of government spending, right, or tax cut will have no real effect on the demand, simply because people anticipate this and people take it as a signal for higher expenses in the future, right? Second major point of difference is your consumer behavior. So when there is an expansionary fiscal policy, whenever there is an expansionary fiscal policy that takes place, the consumer tends to spend more. But Ricardian equivalence states that people tend to save more in such cases, right? And as far as the effect on the economy is concerned, any sort of government spending to cover that fiscal gap, right, is an expansionary kind of a force, whereas according to Ricardian equivalence, it is neutral, right? So basically, fiscal deficit states that spend more to grow, but Ricardian equivalence will say that it will have absolutely no effect on the economy. So whatever effort the government is putting, the consumers will offset it anyway. So there is absolutely no use. One thing you must remember is that Ricardo belongs to the classical school of thought, and they were very much against government's interference. The classical school of thought is mainly based on the idea that the government interference should be minimum, right? So we should remember the hack to this is that any sort of government interference in terms of spending, in terms of tax cuts or tax increases, will have absolutely no impact on the economy, isn't it? It's the market forces that will actually affect the country, isn't it? Okay. So once we are done with the basics, let's answer this question here, right? Under Ricardian equivalence, a tax cut financed by borrowing will, so we know that under Ricardian equivalence, there will be absolutely no effect on the economy, no effect on the consumption. But if it would have been a fiscal deficit opinion, then definitely a tax cut implies an expansionary fiscal policy which will increase the consumption of the country, right? But we have to keep into mind the reality as well. Now, first thing, the first shock of reality is that the consumers are not always aware. There are certain points of asymmetric information that is present, right? So people are not fully rational. That's why Ricardian equivalence cannot function perfectly in the real world scenario. Second is that there are borrowing constraints as well, that government can reduce taxes or increase spending to a certain limit, right? It cannot do that infinitely, and that was not taken into account by the Ricardian equivalence. Okay, and lastly, there is always uncertainty about future taxes, right? We did not see the petrol price hike coming, did we, before the war began? But still we are facing the consequences right now, isn't it? So therefore the reality is way different than what is presented in the theories. So where fiscal deficit opinion is a practical one, the Ricardian equivalence is mainly based on theory. And that's why, because practicality matters, that's why the governments do adopt fiscal policies at present to revive the economy. So I hope the concept became clearer after this battle, and you can actually think about whether the fiscal deficit view is more beneficial for the economy or the Ricardian equivalence. The choice is yours. Thank you so much for watching. We'll come up with another interesting battle in the next video. Till then, take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.